Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Joanna Flynn, and I'm here from Carolina Public Humanities at UNC Chapel Hill. And I'm delighted to be here again for this year's William S. Bretman Lecture. And on behalf of Carolina Public Humanities, I want to say a huge thank you to our friends here at Wayne Community College, who we have been working with for years on events like this one, and also on other initiatives like supporting teacher workshops for local educators here in Wayne County. It is always a special treat to be here in Goldsboro and to catch up on all of the exciting projects that the foundation has going on. Here at the outset of the evening, I want to remind everyone to please turn off your cell phones, and also to encourage you to hold on to any questions that might come up during tonight's talk, because we will have time for Q&A at the end, as well as a chance for more conversation out by the book signing table afterwards. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Kathleen DuVal. Dr. DuVal earned her doctorate in history from UC Davis, and she teaches at UNC Chapel Hill, where she specializes in early American history. In particular, her work aims to broaden scholarly understanding of early America by centering voices and experiences that have too often been pushed to the margins of our national origin stories, including those of Native Americans, African Americans, and women. In addition to teaching and publishing numerous scholarly articles and books, she has made a point throughout her career of engaging with the public. She has contributed book reviews and articles to public outlets like the New York Times and The Atlantic, and has spoken at libraries, bookshops, festivals, PBS, and more. The research she will be presenting on tonight comes from her 2024 book titled Native Nations, A Millennium in North America, for which she was awarded numerous prizes, including the Bancroft Prize and the Pulitzer. Dr. DuVal is currently on fellowship at the National Humanities Center, where she's working on a project about Yorktown. So we are very grateful she was willing to step away from the writing, go on the road, and bring this conversation to Wayne County. Now I hope you will all join me in welcoming Dr. DuVal.
Thank you, Joanna. It's a pleasure to be here. Big thank you also to Charlotte Brow, and I'm really appreciative of this collaboration between Carolina Public Humanities and the Wayne Community College Foundation. I think it's a really fruitful relationship, and I'm glad to be part of it. So as Joanna said, my book covers about 1,000 years of history, and so if we wanted to stay here for, 10 hours or so, I feel like I could cover it. I could do a pretty good job of it, but you probably want to get out and get to have dinner and everything. So I'm going to start pretty close to the beginning of that 1,000 years, and we'll see how far we get. But then feel free in the question and answer if you want to talk about the American Revolution, because there's lots to talk about there, or anything else. I'm happy to answer questions. But we're going to start around the year 1300, near what today is Phoenix. At the time, if you'll picture it with me, a great chief called Savani ruled over a mighty civilization. It had a vast irrigation system that watered some 15,000 acres of crops for 4 large cities. There were many pyramids, and a great castle that the Spanish later would name Casa Grande, big house, and not very imaginatively. By the time of this great chief Savani, his civilization, called the Hohokam, had thrived in the desert for nearly 1,000 years. Now, it's going to take the city of Phoenix another 700 years to get that old. We'll see if it gets there. Descendants, we will not see if it gets there. Somebody will see if it gets there. Descendants of the Hohokam today tell about this great chief Savani in their oral history. They say he had reaped very large harvests with his 2 servants, the wind and the storm cloud. But he had grown angry with them and had sent them away. Now, if you are a great leader dependent on agriculture to feed your people, is it a good idea to send away wind and storm cloud? No, he should have known. Without them, the crops didn't grow. The people, as the oral history tells, came near dying of hunger. So Savani called wind and storm cloud home, but that backfired. The oral history says, so much rain fell that the whole country was covered in water. Now, the power of rulers like Savani rested on their ability to provide the water and the sun that allowed the crops to grow. And when he proved unable to control the weather or made bad decisions about the weather, he lost his awesome power in the eyes of his people. So one day, he was looking out from one of his city's towers, and he could see a mass of people coming toward it. They were chanting, this is a somewhat clumsy English translation, but something like, "There stands the doomed habitation, about the pueblo runs its frightened chieftain." So not good news for Savani. In fact, the great Chief Savani was one of countless leaders across North America in the 1200s and 1300s who faced both environmental and political disaster, and ultimately the destruction of the cities and the civilizations over which they ruled. This is true there, where he was, for the Hahugum, also in places like Chaco Canyon in what's now New Mexico, and for the peoples whom archaeologists call Mississippians in the Mississippi Valley, including around here in the southeast. But let me back up. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself to focus on the fall of these cities. Let's back up and talk about why they were there in the first place. First of all, there were great cities in North America long before Europeans arrived. That's worth sitting with for just a moment. We can still see their great adobe works in the Southwest. Around here in the Mississippi Valley and the Southeast, it's more likely to come in the form of what we know as Indian mounds. Right? Indian mounds were actually flat-top pyramids on top of which there would be palaces and temples and such. So their ruins are not as noticeable and remarkable as some of those in the Southwest. One of the places, the biggest of the Mississippian cities, was at Cahokia, in what's now Illinois, across the Mississippi River from St. Louis. But there were also places like in North Carolina, including what's known today as Town Creek Indian Mound. These cities arose around a millennium ago. And at the time, their size was similar to cities in other parts of the world, including in Western Europe. And that wasn't coincidental. Cities, urban civilizations, were able to arise because of the spread of large-scale agriculture. And the spread of large-scale agriculture was possible because of what climatologists call the medieval warm period. The medieval warm period began around the 9th century, and as its name implies, it was warmer than the period before or after it. And it also was a period, for whatever reason, of more predictable weather than before or after it. And both of those things are good for farming. Right? Warmth, longer growing season, more predictable weather, good for farming. And so the medieval warm period allowed large-scale agriculture to spread north into what's now the United States from where it had begun in central Mexico. And the same thing was happening in Western Europe at the same time. So these cities had these flat-top pyramid mounds on which buildings were built. They had powerful leaders who were both religious and political leaders, often ruling from those pyramids, from those mounds. But by the time Spanish explorers arrived in the 16th century, the highly centralized urban civilizations of the Southwest and the Mississippi Valley had either spread out or been completely abandoned. North America changed dramatically between 1200 and 1400, and for reasons that had nothing to do with Europeans because they weren't here yet. Now, one of the reasons, maybe the most important reason for these changes was climate change. I mentioned the medieval warm period. After that came what climatologists call the Little Ice Age, which you can tell by the name is not going to be as good for farming. A period of colder weather, shorter growing seasons, and less predictable weather. It came with droughts and floods in different times in different places and affected other parts of the globe. So for example, Genghis Khan would capitalize on the troubles and famines caused by drought to conquer much of Central Asia. Now, it didn't happen all at once, but over time, summers shortened, winters lengthened. In the depths of the Little Ice Age, the annual global temperature was 5 degrees colder than it was during the medieval warm period, which doesn't sound that much, but is bad if you're a farmer. Around the world, famine helped to bring down the 300-year-old Ming Dynasty and killed many thousands of people in Japan and Korea, and millions of people in Europe and India. The Little Ice Age was particularly hard on large, centralized, agriculture-based cities around the world, including those in North America. In these times of hardship and famine, leaders like Savani struggled to maintain their positions, especially if they'd claimed power over weather, right? As weather becomes unpredictable, their power starts to look thin, starts to look maybe not real. As in many other parts of the globe, the urbanized settlements of North America could no longer deliver the kind of health and prosperity that they had in earlier generations. People saw conditions getting worse in their lifetimes: less food, more poverty, a declining future for their children. Now, as we know from our own day, there may be climate change that has nothing or something to do with us, but how we react to it has everything to do with politics and our own personal circumstances. What we give up and what we hold on to, what we stop believing in, where we put our faith, those all depend on human decisions. And so it's easy to look at the archaeological record of these abandoned cities, the people left behind, and assumed that societies declined. But in the oral history that I talked about earlier, about Savani, his fall and the fall of the Hahagam people is actually, these are their ancestors, right? This is actually part of their creation story, how they became the people that they think of themselves as today. Their oral history tells of how they became the Otham nations, which are now in Arizona and northern Sonora in Mexico. Their oral history tells about how they rejected a less sustainable civilization and became who they are as a people, a creation story. Oral history, archaeological evidence, and written evidence all show that large populations survived in all of these places by changing how they lived, by creating smaller scale societies that worked better for their people and worked better with their environments. So basically they had just as many people, but their societies were smaller scale and more spread out. Gradually, across native North America, and this is just north of central Mexico stayed hierarchical and urbanized. People developed a deep distrust of centralization, hierarchy, and inequality. The residents of North America's great cities turned away from urbanization and political and economic centralization and built new ways of living. Smaller scale communities allowed for both more sustainable economies and more widespread political participation. And people instituted a variety of checks and balances to try to make sure that very, very powerful leaders didn't rise again. Now, many places had never established the hierarchical structures of a place like Cahokia or the Hahagam, but generally, across the continent, there were these urban civilizations that gave way to smaller scale civilizations. North America's cities were built for the conditions of the medieval warm period, and maybe some of them were stretching the limits of their resources even then. The Hahagam of the Southwest suffered both drought and flooding, which is terrible if you're farming in the desert, right? In the past, a major flood came maybe once a generation. But in the 15 years starting in 1298, about the time that Savani was ruling, the Salt River flooded 5 times. So basically, flooding went from maybe once a generation to once every 3 years. Powerful surges of the Salt and Gila rivers destroyed canal lines, flooded fields, and ruined crops. And people went hungry. Right? Unprecedented numbers of women died in childbirth, unprecedented numbers of infants who were born died before their first birthdays, lifespans decreased, and people blamed their leaders. And they blamed the whole way of life that their leaders stood for. And all across the continent, people changed how they lived. In the Otham oral history of how Sevanni and the other Hohokam leaders fell, and the Otham, the later people, came to be, the people brought down the cities one by one. To restore a better balance with the land, they needed to destroy the powers that had been misused forever, including making sure not only that each formerly powerful leader was taken down and killed, but that, as one of the oral histories puts it, the understandings that he had were gone. In the Mississippian city of Cahokia, residents responded to food shortages by moving away. At first, some just moved out of the main cities into smaller towns, but then as conditions worsened, huge numbers left Cahokia's realm entirely. As Cahokia's leaders struggled to keep their power, it seems that they grew more tyrannical. They beheaded people who opposed them, and rebellion and war broke out, which then prompted more people to flee. By the late 1400s, the cities of Cahokia's realm were completely gone. Their palisades and buildings burned or fallen in, their pyramids, plazas, and fields overgrown with vines. In fact, the region around Cahokia was so emptied out that archaeologists call it the vacant quarter. It's basically right around there, nobody was living anymore. All of the river valley towns were evacuated, and the few people who remained in the region moved into the uplands and stopped building cities and pyramids. And change like that happened all across the Mississippi region and the Southeast. In the Ohio Valley and the Cumberland Valley of Tennessee, places where Cahokia's influence had inspired other cities to rise, people moved back to smaller towns. In the Piedmont region around here and in Georgia, people abandoned the cities and larger towns around 1450. Now, there still were some smaller towns that still had a pyramid mound, maybe. But by the 15th century, most people lived on farms. Archaeologists have found tens of thousands of farms in the Georgia Piedmont alone. People were slowly building less centralized and more sustainable ways of living that could better feed people and shelter them in what was becoming an unpredictable climate. And this is what I'll talk about for the rest of my talk, for most of the rest of my talk. They were creating more equitable ways of living together in hopes of preventing the rise of leaders who might seize too much power and maybe cause trouble again. Cherokee oral history tells that there once was a priestly caste called the Anikutani, of whom the people stood in great awe. The Anikutani built pyramids, they controlled the religious ceremonies. As one account explains, no one knows how they came to power or how long they maintained it, but over a period of time they became haughty, insolent, overbearing, and licentious to an intolerable degree. In the words of another version, the people long brooded in silence over the oppressions and outrages of this high caste, whom they deeply hated but greatly feared. Now, in different versions of Cherokee history, the spark that begins the revolution against these Anikutani, these elite leaders, it's different in different versions. But all of them basically tell that, in the words of one of them, at last their power was annihilated by the nation because the people rose up and destroyed a hereditary secret society, since which time no hereditary privileges have ever been tolerated among the Cherokees. Lessons told by descendants of Chaco Canyon in New Mexico tell of a similar sort of rejecting of hierarchical leaders. In this history, it was wizards who had misled some leaders, who then became corrupt and hoarded wealth and power. Some people fought against the leaders, others simply left. According to the creation story of Acoma Pueblo, a large group left and created a new home where, it says, they went through the ceremony of forgetting and left their sickness and trouble behind. In a Navajo version of the history of Chaco's fall, the great gambler was a stranger who tricked people into building Chaco, but eventually they rebelled against him. The smaller scale Pueblo communities of later centuries, which are still in New Mexico and Arizona, with more public religion and shared governance, represented a conscious, deliberate rejection of Chaco's centralized rule and religion. Now, ruins like those at Chaco Canyon and Casa Grande, vacant mounds like what we can see at Cahokia today, they kind of can make us think about collapse. Maybe there was a golden age of cities that tragically was lost. But the generations that followed the city's rise generally describe the change as for the good, and what came later as better. And they may have had a point. Smaller communities were easier to keep clean, easier to keep free of human waste. Families lived in fairly uniform houses and received the same rituals after death. There were no more palaces, no more walls. Some of the cities had walled people off from other people at the height of the urbanization. The biggest pyramids were abandoned, but descendants would continue to visit them because they carried an important connection to the past. All across North America, the process of decentralization continued over several centuries. Descendants of the Hohokam in the Southwest spread out into towns of between 100 and a few thousand. Descendants of the Mississippian cities spread along the Mississippi and Illinois and Ohio, Missouri, Arkansas rivers, and across a huge expanse of the Southeast, including in what's now North Carolina. Now, the first European explorers who came to North America got a glimpse of this changing world. In the river valleys of the Southwest, where the Hohokam had farmed, 16th century explorers found large populations, irrigated fertile fields, but no big cities. An explorer who traveled with Francisco de Coronado in what's now about probably Arizona marveled in 1539 at fields so stocked with food that there is enough to supply more than 300 horsemen, and so well irrigated that it is like a garden. In the Southeast, Hernando de Soto did see some remaining smaller cities, large towns, in some cases with leaders still ruling from pyramid mounds. But these were part of a late stage of decentralization. None of these cities were nearly as large as Cahokia or had its influence, and many places that had had cities just didn't have cities anymore at all. Now, Spanish explorers were still impressed. A town of a few thousand was still a city in 16th century Spain. But in later centuries, Europeans and white Americans would assume, not knowing this longer history, that North America's native societies were primitive, were simple, were timeless, in fact, had never had major change happen to them, and that they could have never had cities. Now, in fact, the Native American polities that Europeans and white Americans encountered were far from primitive. Societies that discourage people, discourage leaders from accumulating wealth, and encourage the sharing of wealth require very complicated structures. As one anthropologist puts it, egalitarian societies do not just happen. Anishinaabe historian Carrie Miller explains that Native American non-hierarchical political systems were neither weak nor random, but highly organized and deliberate. So, Native North Americans developed, in the aftermath of the fall of cities, developed complicated economic, political, social, and religious structures that encouraged shared prosperity and shared decision-making. So I'm going to talk about those economic structures, political structures, and religious structures. So first, economics. Native North Americans, after the fall of cities, put a high priority on diversifying food sources. And it makes sense, right? If you've lived in a society that has had famine, where people have starved to death in large numbers, it's going to become very important to have as many different kinds of food sources in case one fails, right? Women grew beans and squash in the same field as corn so that the beans grew up the corn stalks and the squash vines covered the mounds to discourage weeds. Now, when Europeans came and saw this kind of field, they looked very messy. In fact, the European who made the engraving on the right has neatened up the fields to make them legible to European viewers, right? But they would not have been planted in rows. In fact, they would have been planted on small mounds, each with a corn stalk. Now, in order not to depend solely on agriculture, Native American societies began to hunt more and to gather more. So there's a stereotype of Native Americans as hunting and gathering, but in fact, in this era, they began to hunt and gather more than their ancestors had in order to have diversified sources of food, a safety net when drought or other disasters stressed supplies. They also expanded trade. They increased their numbers of trading partners. So if their crops failed, maybe they could trade with a trading partner whose crops had done better that year. Otham scholar David Martinez, so he's descended from the Hohokam as part of the Otham today. He explains that according to Otham oral tradition, we had this great civilization that suffered environmental catastrophe. Hohokam's descendants, though, temporarily migrated away from the Salt and Gila rivers to let the land heal, and then slowly returned. Within 2 centuries of their abandonment of the cities, descendants of the Hohokam were again farming along the Gila River and its tributaries, but on smaller farms, with a diversified economy that had reserved sources of sustenance for times when the rains might not come or the rivers might overflow. The Otham call their way of life himdag. It basically means their way of life. But specifically, because this is their way of life, it means a practical way of living in the Sonoran Desert, surviving in a desert. People are supposed to share with one another according to what they have, especially food and water. Giving away a surplus, as they see it, is an investment. As one Tohono O'odham book explains, this sharing of goods and food created a debt that was expected to be repaid whenever the others had a surplus. Now, O'odham means people, and there were different kinds of O'odham who specialized in different kinds of food production. So there were river O'odham who lived near the river and were mostly agricultural, but then there were desert O'odham who lived more of the year in the desert and harvested the crops of the desert and the game of the desert and traded with the river O'odham. The reciprocal trading ties among different O'odham groups supported the stability and sustainability of all the groups of O'odham. Now, the way the O'odham describe their himdag reflects a more continent-wide philosophy of reciprocity, an ideal of sharing and balance that undergirded economics and politics and religion across much of the continent. Lumbee legal scholar Robert Williams explains, connection to others improved the chances of overcoming some calamity or disaster that might befall the individual or group. Historian Daniel Richter calls this system a sort of upside-down capitalism, in which the aim is not to accumulate goods, but to be in a position to provide them to others. So the idea of reciprocity is if you have more, you have to give more, not just out of the goodness of your heart, but because it's an investment and because it increases your prestige and power and that of your people. Reciprocity was important within as well as between societies. In most Native societies, men and women were assigned separate but equally important and interdependent roles in feeding and caring for their people. So, for example, in most Native societies, women were responsible for farming and gathering, men were responsible for hunting and fishing. All right, for politics, political changes. As reciprocal economies emerged, the nature of leadership and expectations of leaders changed all across the continent. Native North Americans almost universally created political structures designed to balance power, to provide all members with a say in governance, to prevent the rise of tyrants, to prevent going back to the time of leaders like Savani or the Anikudani. Power and prestige lay not in amassing wealth, but in assuring that wealth was shared wisely. Leaders earned support in part by being good providers. And the systems were purposefully balanced. So there might be a male council and a female council. There might be a war chief and a peace chief. There might sometimes even be leaders who were appointed to argue different sides of an issue, to let the, kind of like a court of law, right? To let the people as a jury figure out what was the best path to take. By the 18th century, for example, each town in the Cherokee Nation had a war chief and a peace chief, a council of male advisors, a council of women in charge of food and shelter, and its own priests. So a town would have its own priests. But then the clans themselves were spread across multiple towns. So the power of the clans then would balance out the power of the town leadership. Many Native societies had a requirement that if there was a very big issue to debate, such as going to war, you had to assemble all of the people, men, women, children, to discuss what to do. Hundreds or even thousands might show up, depending on how momentous the decision was. And they were supposed to reach consensus. Now, consensus is hard, and the bigger your group is, the harder it is. And they didn't always achieve it. But one rule that many of them had was if a consensus seemed to be emerging about a decision, and if you yourself felt that you could never agree with that position, you were literally supposed to leave. If you couldn't be part of the decision, but you were going to lose, if it had been a majority rule situation, you needed to just remove yourself completely. So there were leaders, there were powerful people, but they generally governed by gaining consent. This new, wider political participation is evident in public architecture that emerged after the cities. There were no more 10-story high pyramids that might have temples and palaces on top where the people couldn't see what was happening. Instead, many of these towns built a mound, but it was only inches high. Everybody could see what was happening, and you could even go on top of it. The people were part of religion and of politics. Towns continued to form the center of politics in post-Mississippian societies, and the town square was a central and sacred, but largely public space. The Otham descendants of the Hohokam began building stadiums again in the period of the most urbanization and centralization and the very powerful political religious leaders. They'd stopped having this tradition of ball play against other towns. Things were more walled off. They opened back up again and built stadiums again. Now, the decline of hierarchy doesn't mean there was no inequality or that everyone lived in peace with each other and with nature. Those stereotypes would be just as wrong as the stereotype, the belief that Native Americans could never build a city. Right? In many Native societies, political and religious leaders had to come from a certain family or clan or town or division. But within those requirements, individual leaders were also usually chosen for bravery, oratory, wisdom. Iroquois governance, Haudenosaunee governance, illustrates one form of balancing power. So every person belonged to a matrilineal clan that they inherited from their mother. And those clans worked across not only Haudenosaunee towns, Iroquois towns, but the various nations, the Mohawks and Senecas and other nations that were part of the Haudenosaunee. Women ran the clans, which were responsible for local governance, whereas men were representative to the Grand Council that brought the Six Nations together. Each council member was chosen by a clan mother, and usually she chose from within a sort of set of cousins within her matrilineage. So it was an office that both was inherited, right? They had to come from this lineage, but also you had to deserve. Like it went to somebody who seemed deserving of it, and they could be brought back, and then she could appoint a different one if he wasn't seeming to do a good job. Now, early modern European observers had a very difficult time understanding leadership like this. The word for representative in the National Council was royaner in Iroquois, Haudenosaunee. And Europeans, they had trouble translating it. They translated it as lord or noble because they sort of knew there was something inherited within it because of these lineages. But they couldn't understand the checks and balances that were so unlike the monarchies that were emerging and centralizing at the time in Europe. Similarly, Europeans translated the Muskogean word Miko as king, even though they looked around and they saw that there are an awful lot of Mikos, so king can't be exactly the right word. And the word chief reflects this sort of European confusion. They came up with chief by sort of reflecting back on their own pre-monarchical past to try to come up with a word that seemed to sort of describe this kind of leader that was definitely not a king. And European observers completely failed to notice women's power to govern clans and towns and fields. Now, like politics, religion now involved more public participation. Many societies cut or weaken the link between religious power and political power. So in the past, it would have been a leader who had both, right, like Sewanee. Now they split those kinds of power. Cherokee oral tradition, for example, notes that after the fall of the Anikutani, thereafter, the priestly function were assumed by individual medicine men. Priests didn't rule the towns anymore. All across North America, societies continued many of the religious beliefs and practices of the past, but in a less hierarchical way. Priests now, like other kinds of leaders, were responsible to the people. Religious practices were usually public and participatory. Still today, centuries later, Native nations from the Southeast and Mississippi Valley integrate the ancient past into their ceremonial grounds and public spaces. As you can see, the modern public building housing the Muskogee Creek National Council is set within a mound, right, echoing back to that longer past. When the Choctaws were forced west in the 1830s, they named the site of their new council house in Indian Territory for their mother mound. And that mother mound today belongs to the Mississippi Band of Choctaws who managed to stay in the homeland. Religious iconography, things like these symbols up there, were democratized. So these are symbols that are very old or part of the hierarchical era. In that era, they would mostly have been only on sacred objects and places where the elite were, not part of people's everyday life. That totally changed. Those same symbols started to be made on just everyday, like plates and things like that people had in their homes, bringing religion to the people. Now, I don't want to give the impression that all of this functioned perfectly. Reciprocity, consensus, broad political and religious participation, those are values, common general beliefs about the right way to live. Values are guidelines, right? They're aspirations. They are not necessarily descriptions of how people actually act. And that may be one of the reasons why so many oral histories repeat these lessons over and over, because their own people in their own day did not always act according to those values. The transition from the urban period was not uniform or always smooth. And even in societies with structures that were designed to prevent dictatorial power, sometimes individual leaders amassed a great deal of power and expanded their influence through warfare on other societies. And in fact, it seems that without large and powerful centers to maintain a monopoly on violence, war actually increased in many places. A town leader or a band leader could just decide he wanted to raise a war party and go fight somebody else without it being the decision being made in a centralized way. The replacement of centralization and hierarchy with diversified economies and decentralized and democratized power structures would end up looking to Americans like evidence that Native people were and always had been primitive. In the 1880s, archaeologist Andolph Bandelier, fully steeped in the idea that American Indians were primitive, he observed the ruins of the Hahugum and decided that, as Bandelier wrote, nowhere have they been able to raise their general culture or ideas of social organization beyond that of the tribe or a tribal confederacy, a communistic democracy with prominent military features and a controlling element of religion. So Bandelier is looking at Native societies. He calls them communistic democracies. He finds all of this primitive, whereas he believed that the United States that sought to replace them would make better use of their land. In fact, Phoenix is named for that idea, that out of the ashes of the Hahugum would come a great American civilization. Bandelier inherited his 19th century prejudices from the fact that Western Europe took a different path in the Little Ice Age. For Europeans, the city became the marker of civilization. They have the same root, right? City and civilization. For the most part, Europeans doubled down on hierarchy and centralization as a means of dealing with the same kind of difficult times in the Little Ice Age that they were facing, in North America. Europeans' resulting beliefs informed later anthropological models, still taught in schools today, of how societies develop. And this is sort of this imagined progression, natural progression of societies, that they start as hunter-gatherers, they move into discovering agriculture, urbanizing, then they become part of history when they discover writing. Then there's an age of absolute monarchs, and then only eventually can they develop democracies. Europeans interpreted these steps from their own history as universal steps. But the descendants of North American cities tell a different story. They tell cautionary stories of leaders who had seized too much power, retelling over and over again the history of taking down powerful leaders, letting the land heal, and building a more sustainable, more egalitarian life, ideally would remind people of why they lived the way they did. Let me just wrap up with some implications for post-1492 North America. Now, it goes without saying that there would be hard times to come. Europeans and their descendants would bring great disruptions to the continent, especially in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. But the political structures founded in the centuries after the cities fell provided some protection. Smaller, more spread out towns and the buffer zones between them allowed for better responses to disease, more ability to isolate and quarantine. Decentralization meant it was harder for Europeans to find a central leader or city to conquer in order to gain an empire. That's what happened with the Aztecs in central Mexico, or the Incas in Peru. There's nobody like that for European power to then be able to claim to have taken over an entire civilization. Loose confederacies proved remarkably able to incorporate refugees, even entire towns. Their willingness to tolerate and benefit from linguistic and cultural diversity helped to maintain and rebuild nations in the face of colonialism, and is part of why there are still over 600 federally and state-recognized tribes in the United States today. As Europeans came in the coming centuries, Native nations would need every advantage they could muster. Their long history of change and adaptation helped Native nations survive into the present and into whatever future we all face. I think there's time for some questions, if people have questions. No.
Dr. DuVal, so the ancient cities in North America, they certainly advanced. Of course, not like you said the Aztec, the Mayan. Did they ever, is there any indication they ever had a written language? I know they have petroglyphs and the drawings.
Right, yeah. So they were really all oral culture. So they had all kinds of ways of, we might call them mnemonic devices for remembering things that they had sort of memorized. So, for example, the Kiowas have bison hides, and so the Kiowa historians were supposed to come up with sort of pictures to remind themselves of like the most important events that happened in a year, and they'd be in order. So if you asked a Kiowa historian back then, he would be able to tell you, you know, this happened this year, and then this happened the next year, because he could look at that and be reminded of. But the way that they did that was, you know, was oral, right? They did not have written languages. Now, after Europeans came, they very rapidly developed written languages, and so, you know, by the late 1600s, there are New England tribes that they use Roman languages. You know, I think all of them, but the Cherokees end up using Roman alphabets, Roman letters to write down their languages, but they sort of seize on that as one more way to communicate and write down history.
How do you think the impact of the large landmass here in North America made a difference in how Europeans responded to the same climate impacts as the North Americans?
That is an excellent question, and I hadn't thought about that before. There is more flexibility here. That's right. So even though we're talking about, you know, cities the size, right, that's a brilliant point. I had really not thought about that. But that's yeah, you take a city that's maybe the size of Marseille, and you can spread that out across rivers onto fertile farmland in many, many parts of what's now the United States that you couldn't do in places in Europe where either you would run into the mountains or things were already too crowded. Even with, I mean, there's huge population loss in Europe because of the same reason, so there's a little more room to spread out. Yeah, but I think you're exactly right. The large continent here allows. So many people ask me why did things go so differently in the two different places, and I'm going to add this to one of the reasons I give. That's really smart.
So many of the burial places around the world were burial mounds. Having lived in Cahokia, but that wasn't a burial mound, it was an elevated pyramid, right?
Well, this one wasn't a burial mound, but they did have burial mounds, yeah. So you're right, that is not. But they had, at the end of sort of the long pathway, there was a burial mound, yeah. And there's some evidence that the burials, archaeologists have found burials around Cahokia that look like there may be some human sacrifice, or at least a suspiciously large number of young people in the same grave, right, which suggests that. But it seems to possibly been about the time when disaster really was striking, and maybe the leaders were panicking. But many of these cities didn't have burial mounds. Yeah.
So I don't know how much you know about the Mayan cultures, but I just wondered the same basic thing, which was if climate change and that kind of thing had a big effect on the North American ones, but then in Mayans more close to the equator, wouldn't they have not been as affected by a little ice age or something like that? Wouldn't they have been more stable?
Yeah, so
but they disappeared anyway.
Yeah, right. So the Aztecs aren't. So the story's very neat when you compare to the Aztecs, because they remain very hierarchical and centralized, and it makes sense because they don't face the kind of climate change that places farther north did. But I have recently been talking to Mayan historians and archaeologists, and I think there are a lot of possibilities of comparing things, not directly, not neatly, because of course it's in a place that would be less, if at all, affected by the changes of the Little Ice Age. But there are some political structures and religious structures that get set up after the fall of cities that I think are directly comparable. So yeah, I think there's more to be sort of thought through there.
to bring it to a contemporary issue, the Lumbeys right now are having a bit of difficulty getting recognized. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let me, as a historian, let me step back from it rather than talk about just what happened this week. I'll sort of step back to the longer history because, yeah. So, when Europeans come to what's now the United States, it matters very much how many of them come to a certain place, right? So for, say, just to compare, say, the Cherokees and the Lumbeys, the ancestors of the Lumbeys were very early surrounded by European colonists and lost their land and had to make a great number of compromises and changes to stay basically in their homeland. They are the Lumbeys are a conglomerated people. They actually descend from multiple linguistic groups. And under the pressure of colonialism, they banded together and retained their identity as Indians, right? But by combining. And that's why it's much harder for them to be able to do the kinds of things that federal recognition requires. Federal recognition requires basically a paper trail that your people today is the same people who were there at the time the United States was created, right? That is easier for a nation that was still completely independent and sovereign in 1776, like the Cherokees. They clearly existed in 1776. They fought a war against the rebels, the Americans in the American Revolution, and signed treaties with the United States. The Lumbeys never signed treaties with the United States. Some of their ancestors signed treaties with the English, but they don't have the federal recognition. The easiest way to get federal recognition is to have a treaty relationship with the United States. And if your people was surrounded by colonists and was no longer independent, no longer making treaties by the time there was a United States, it's much, much more difficult. And so that's why, so just to take another example, the Pamunkeys in Virginia, they're Pocahontas's people. I mean, they're totally Indians, right? There's no question. They only got federal recognition in the 21st century. So much, much more difficult for coastal peoples, North Carolina, Virginia, New England, but also around New Orleans and in California, for coastal peoples who were surrounded quickly or brought into the United States late, in the case of California, to establish the same kind of paper trail that the federally recognized tribes had. But yeah, they may. We'll see.
Thank you so much for this. Following up on that point about paper trails, I'm really curious to hear more about your methodology, especially for places in this kind of deep history where you're able to get so specific as in the timing of certain floods and things like that. So would you be able to share that with us?
Thank you. So it really is like drawing on as many different kinds of evidence as possible. So oral history is in no way designed to give dates, right? So that doesn't help with that. But what oral history can sometimes give is the why of something. So we've got all this archaeology that shows there were urbanized, centralized, large population centers in North America, and then there weren't, right? And we have climate data that actually sometimes can give us actual dates of flooding and things like that. And I don't understand how they do that, but when I read it in a report and I assume it's true. Maybe it won't be. And then what I was really surprised when I was working on this is how unanimous the oral histories are across the continent in explaining there was an era with very powerful leaders that we brought down. And it just mapped on to these other kinds of evidence in ways that oral history usually doesn't. It's just for such different purposes. But these were memorable events, and they imprinted themselves on oral histories that have lasted hundreds and hundreds of years. That's great. Thank you. Well, thank you all. And thanks again to Carolina Public Humanities and the Foundation.